Margaret, known as the Maid of Norway, was born in 1283 in Tonsberg, Norway. She was the only child of King Eric II of Norway and Margaret of Scotland, the daughter of King Alexander III of Scotland. Her birth was significant for both Norway and Scotland, as she was the granddaughter of the Scottish king and the only legitimate heir to the Norwegian throne. The political landscape of late 13th century Europe was marked by dynastic alliances, territorial disputes, and the constant threat of war. The birth of Margaret was seen as a potential bridge between two kingdoms. The royal court in Tonsberg was a place of order and tradition. The Norwegian monarchy, though not as wealthy or powerful as some of its European counterparts, maintained a structured and ceremonial environment. Margaret's early years were spent in the care of her father's household, surrounded by courtiers, servants, and advisors. The climate was cold, the days often short, and the sea was a constant presence in the lives of the Norwegian people. In Scotland, the death of King Alexander III in 1286 created a crisis. With no surviving sons, the Scottish throne was left without a clear male heir. The Scottish nobility and clergy, aware of the dangers of a succession crisis, looked to Margaret, the king's granddaughter, as the legitimate successor. Her claim was recognized by the Guardians of Scotland, a group of nobles appointed to govern the kingdom during the interregnum. Margaret's life changed dramatically when she was declared Queen of Scots at the age of 3. She was still in Norway, far from the land she was now expected to rule. The Scottish court, meanwhile, was divided by competing interests and the ambitions of powerful families. The English king, Edward I, also saw an opportunity to influence Scottish affairs and began to assert his authority over the succession. The journey from Norway to Scotland was not immediate. Negotiations between the Norwegian and Scottish courts, as well as the involvement of England, delayed Margaret's arrival. The young queen remained in Norway under the protection of her father and the Norwegian regency. Her daily life was shaped by the routines of the royal household, the teachings of the church, and the expectations placed upon her as a child monarch. The political situation in Scotland grew increasingly unstable. Factions formed around different claimants to the throne, and the threat of civil war loomed. The presence of a child queen living in another country added to the uncertainty. The Scottish people, however, accepted Margaret as their sovereign, and preparations were made for her eventual coronation. In 1290, arrangements were finalized for Margaret to travel to Scotland. The journey was to be undertaken by sea, a dangerous and unpredictable route. A group of Scottish and Norwegian nobles, along with church officials, were tasked with escorting the young queen. The voyage was seen as a moment of hope for both kingdoms, a chance to secure peace and stability through the person of a child. The scene at the Norwegian port was somber and formal. Margaret, only 7 years old, was dressed in royal garments, surrounded by attendants and guardians. The ship that would carry her to Scotland was prepared with care, and prayers were offered for a safe passage. The departure was witnessed by members of the Norwegian court, who understood the significance of the moment. As the ship set sail, Margaret left behind the only home she had ever known. The North Sea was treacherous, and the journey would test the endurance of everyone on board. The fate of two kingdoms rested on the safe arrival of a child who had never set foot in the land she was to rule. The late 13th century in Europe was a period of political complexity and frequent conflict. The Kingdom of Scotland, though independent, was surrounded by powerful neighbors, most notably England. The Scottish monarchy had maintained its independence through a combination of military strength, strategic marriages, and alliances with other European powers, including Norway and France. King Alexander III of Scotland had ruled for over 3 decades, providing stability and continuity. His reign saw the consolidation of royal authority and the expansion of Scottish influence. However, the sudden deaths of his children left the succession in doubt. When Alexander III died in 1286 after falling from his horse, Scotland was left without a direct male heir. The only surviving descendant was his granddaughter Margaret, who was living in Norway. The Scottish nobility, aware of the dangers posed by a disputed succession, acted quickly. They formed a group known as the Guardians of Scotland, tasked with governing the kingdom until a new monarch could be crowned. The Guardians recognized Margaret as the legitimate heir, based on her descent from Alexander III. This decision was supported by the Scottish clergy and many of the leading noble families. Norway, under King Eric II, was a smaller and less powerful kingdom compared to Scotland and England. However, the Norwegian royal family had close ties to the Scottish monarchy through marriage. Margaret's mother, also named Margaret, was the daughter of Alexander III. The union between the Norwegian and Scottish royal houses was intended to strengthen both kingdoms and provide mutual support against external threats. England, under King Edward I, was the dominant power in the British Isles. Edward I was an ambitious and assertive monarch, known for his military campaigns in Wales and his efforts to assert control over Scotland. The death of Alexander III presented Edward with an opportunity to influence the Scottish succession. He offered to act as an arbitrator in the dispute and sought to arrange a marriage between Margaret and his own son, the future Edward II. The negotiations surrounding Margaret's succession were complex and involved multiple parties. The Treaty of Berghem, signed in 1290, outlined the terms under which Margaret would become Queen of Scots. The treaty guaranteed the independence of the Scottish kingdom and the rights of its people, even if Margaret were to marry the English prince. The agreement was intended to prevent Scotland from becoming a vassal state of England. Margaret's position as a child monarch presented unique challenges. She was too young to rule in her own right, and her absence from Scotland created uncertainty. The Guardians of Scotland governed in her name, but their authority was limited by the competing interests of the nobility and the influence of foreign powers. The Scottish people, meanwhile, awaited the arrival of their new queen with a mixture of hope and apprehension. The journey from Norway to Scotland was delayed by diplomatic negotiations and concerns about Margaret's safety. The North Sea was known for its dangerous storms, and the political situation in Scotland remained unstable. The Guardians and the Norwegian Regency worked together to ensure that Margaret's transition to the Scottish throne would be as smooth as possible. Margaret's early life in Norway was shaped by the customs and traditions of the Norwegian court. She was raised as a royal princess with access to education, religious instruction, and the care of experienced attendants. Her upbringing was intended to prepare her for her future role as queen, though she remained largely isolated from the political turmoil unfolding in Scotland. The broader context of Margaret's story includes the shifting alliances and rivalries of medieval Europe. The balance of power between Scotland, England, and Norway was delicate, and the fate of the Scottish crown had implications for the entire region. The involvement of the English king in the Scottish succession was a source of tension, as many Scots feared the loss of their independence. Margaret's status as a child queen was both a symbol of hope and a source of vulnerability. Her claim to the throne was recognized by the leading powers of the day, but her youth and absence from Scotland left her dependent on the actions of others. The political landscape was uncertain, and the future of the Scottish kingdom hung in the balance. Margaret, Maid of Norway, was born in 1283 as the only child of King Eric II of Norway and Margaret of Scotland. Her birth was the result of a dynastic marriage intended to strengthen the ties between Norway and Scotland. Margaret's mother died shortly after her birth, leaving her to be raised by her father and the Norwegian royal household. As a royal child, Margaret's early life was shaped by the customs and expectations of the Norwegian court. She was provided with a household of attendants, tutors, and guardians responsible for her education and well-being. The court at Tonsberg, where she spent much of her childhood, was a center of Norwegian royal authority and culture. Margaret's education would have included instruction in religion, language, and the basic principles of governance. The church played a significant role in her upbringing, as it did for most European royalty of the time. She would have been taught to read and write, to understand the rituals of the church, and to appreciate the responsibilities of her position, despite her royal status. Margaret's life was marked by the loss of her mother and the absence of her father, who was often occupied with the affairs of the kingdom. She was surrounded by courtiers and servants, but her closest relationships were likely with her female attendants and tutors. The Norwegian court was relatively small and close-knit, providing a degree of stability and security. Margaret's claim to the Scottish throne was based on her descent from King Alexander III. As his only surviving grandchild, she was recognized as the legitimate heir by the Scottish nobility and clergy. This recognition placed her at the center of a complex web of political interests, both within Scotland and beyond. Her status as a child monarch presented unique challenges. She was too young to rule independently and was therefore dependent on the regents and guardians appointed to govern in her name. Her absence from Scotland further complicated matters, as she had never set foot in the kingdom she was expected to rule. Margaret's personal qualities are difficult to assess, as few contemporary records describe her character or appearance in detail. She was described as a healthy and intelligent child, well cared for by her Norwegian guardians. Her upbringing was intended to prepare her for a future role as queen, though she remained largely sheltered from the political conflicts surrounding her succession. The expectations placed upon Margaret were considerable. As the heir to two kingdoms, she was seen as a potential unifying figure. Her marriage was the subject of intense negotiation, with the English king seeking to arrange a union with his own son. The Treaty of Bergen outlined the terms of her succession and the conditions under which she would become Queen of Scots. Margaret's life was shaped by the actions of others: her father, the Norwegian Regency, the Scottish guardians, and the English king. She had little control over her own fate, and her role was largely symbolic. The political significance of her position was recognized by all parties, and her safe arrival in Scotland was seen as essential to the stability of the kingdom. Journey from Norway to Scotland was a major event in Margaret's life. She was accompanied by a group of nobles, church officials, and attendants responsible for her safety and well-being. The voyage was undertaken with great care, as the fate of two kingdoms depended on her safe arrival. Margaret's story is one of a child caught in the complexities of medieval politics. Her brief life was marked by the expectations of royalty, the challenges of succession, and the uncertainties of a world in transition. She remains a significant figure in the history of Scotland and Norway, remembered as the Maid of Norway. The political and historical context of Margaret's life was defined by the relationships between Scotland, Norway, and England. In the late 13th century, Scotland was an independent kingdom, but its stability was threatened by the lack of a clear male heir after the death of King Alexander III. The Scottish nobility, clergy, and the wider population were concerned about the possibility of civil war or foreign intervention. The Guardians of Scotland, a group of 6 nobles and bishops, were appointed to govern the kingdom during the interregnum. Their primary responsibility was to maintain order and ensure the succession of a legitimate monarch. The Guardians recognized Margaret as the rightful heir, but her youth and residence in Norway created practical challenges. The Scottish nobility was divided into factions, some supporting Margaret's claim, others favoring alternative candidates. Norway, under King Eric II, was a smaller kingdom with limited resources. The Norwegian monarchy had a history of alliances with Scotland, and the marriage between Eric II and Margaret of Scotland was intended to strengthen these ties. The death of Queen Margaret left King Eric as the sole parent of the Maid of Norway. He was responsible for her upbringing and for negotiating her succession to the Scottish throne. England, ruled by King Edward I, was the dominant power in the British Isles. Edward I was known for his military campaigns and his efforts to expand English influence. The death of Alexander III presented Edward with an opportunity to assert control over Scotland. He offered to act as an arbitrator in the succession dispute and proposed a marriage between Margaret and his son, the future Edward II. This proposal was formalized in the Treaty of Bergen, which guaranteed the independence of Scotland and the rights of its people. Even if Margaret married the English prince, the Treaty of Bergen was a significant diplomatic achievement. It outlined the terms under which Margaret would become Queen of Scots and the conditions of her marriage to the English prince. The treaty specified that Scotland would remain a separate and independent kingdom with its own laws and institutions. The agreement was intended to prevent Scotland from becoming a vassal state of England. Despite these diplomatic efforts, the political situation in Scotland remained unstable. The absence of a resident monarch created uncertainty, and the ambitions of powerful noble families threatened to undermine the Guardian's authority. The involvement of England in the succession process was viewed with suspicion by many Scots, who feared the loss of their independence. The broader European context also influenced events in Scotland and Norway. The late 13th century was a period of shifting alliances and frequent conflict. The balance of power between kingdoms was maintained through dynastic marriages, treaties, and military campaigns. The fate of the Scottish crown had implications for the wider region. As neighboring kingdoms watched developments with interest, Margaret's position as a child monarch was both a symbol of hope and a source of vulnerability. Her claim to the throne was recognized by the leading powers of the day, but her youth and absence from Scotland left her dependent on the actions of others. The Guardians of Scotland governed in her name, but their authority was limited by the competing interests of the nobility and the influence of foreign powers. The journey from Norway to Scotland was delayed by diplomatic negotiations and concerns about Margaret's safety. The North Sea was known for its dangerous storms, and the political situation in Scotland remained unstable. The Guardians and the Norwegian Regency worked together to ensure that Margaret's transition to the Scottish throne would be as smooth as possible. The death of Margaret's mother shortly after her birth left her in the care of her father and the Norwegian royal household. Her upbringing was shaped by the customs and traditions of the Norwegian court, with an emphasis on religious instruction and preparation for her future role as queen. The church played a significant role in her education, as it did for most European royalty of the time. The involvement of the English king in the Scottish succession was a source of tension. Edward I sought to secure his influence over Scotland through the proposed marriage between Margaret and his son. The Treaty of Bergen was intended to address these concerns, but many Scots remained wary of English intentions. The political landscape of late 13th century Europe was characterized by uncertainty and the constant threat of conflict. The fate of the Scottish crown was of great importance to the leading powers of the day, and the safe arrival of Margaret in Scotland was seen as essential to the stability of the kingdom. The key event in Margaret's life was her journey from Norway to Scotland in 1290. After years of negotiation and preparation, arrangements were made for the young queen to travel to her new kingdom. The voyage was undertaken by sea with a group of Scottish and Norwegian nobles, church officials, and attendants responsible for her safety. The departure from Norway was a formal and significant occasion. Margaret, only 7 years old, was dressed in royal garments and accompanied by her guardians. The ship was prepared with care, and prayers were offered for a safe passage. The journey across the North Sea was known to be dangerous, with unpredictable weather and the risk of shipwreck. The voyage began in the late summer of 1290. The ship carrying Margaret and her entourage set sail from Bergen, heading for the Scottish coast. The journey was longer and more difficult than anticipated. The ship encountered storms and rough seas, which delayed their arrival and caused considerable hardship for those on board. During the voyage, Margaret's health began to deteriorate. She became ill, suffering from the effects of the long and difficult journey. The exact nature of her illness is not known, but contemporary accounts describe her as weak and unable to recover. The ship eventually reached the Orkney Islands, a group of islands off the northern coast of Scotland, which were under Norwegian control at the time. Margaret's condition worsened after their arrival in Orkney. Despite the efforts of her attendants and local officials, she did not recover. On the 26th of September 1290, Margaret, Maid of Norway, died at the age of 7. Her death was a significant event, with immediate and far-reaching consequences for both. Scotland and Norway. The news of Margaret's death was met with shock and grief in both kingdoms. In Scotland, the loss of the child queen created a succession crisis, as there was no clear heir to the throne. The guardians of Scotland, who had governed in her name, were left without a monarch to support. The Scottish nobility and clergy were forced to confront the possibility of civil war and foreign intervention. In Norway, King Erik II mourned the loss of his only child. The Norwegian court recognized the significance of Margaret's death, both for the royal family and for the kingdom's relationship with Scotland. The hopes for a peaceful union between the two kingdoms were dashed, and the political landscape of Northern Europe was altered. Margaret's death marked a turning point in the history of Scotland. The succession crisis that followed her death led to a period of instability and conflict known as the Great Cause. Multiple claimants to the Scottish throne emerged, and the involvement of the English king further complicated the situation. Journey from Norway to Scotland, intended to secure the future of two kingdoms, ended in tragedy. Margaret's brief life and untimely death had a profound impact on the political landscape of medieval Europe. The death of Margaret, Maid of Norway, in 1290 had immediate and far-reaching consequences for Scotland, Norway, and the wider region. In Scotland, the loss of the child queen created a power vacuum and triggered a succession crisis. The guardians of Scotland, who had governed in her name, were left without a monarch to support. The Scottish nobility and clergy were forced to confront the possibility of civil war and foreign intervention. The absence of a clear heir to the Scottish throne led to the emergence of multiple claimants. The most prominent were John Balliol and Robert Bruce, both of whom had legitimate claims based on their descent from earlier Scottish kings. The dispute between these claimants became known as the Great Cause, a period of legal and political maneuvering that lasted for several years. The involvement of King Edward I of England further complicated the situation. Edward offered to act as an arbitrator in the succession dispute, but his true aim was to assert control over Scotland. He summoned the Scottish claimants to Norham in 1291 and demanded that they recognize him as overlord of Scotland. The Scottish nobility, facing the threat of civil war, reluctantly agreed to Edward's terms. Edward's intervention marked the beginning of a period of English dominance in Scottish affairs. In 1292, he selected John Balliol as King of Scots, but Balliol's authority was limited by Edward's influence. The Scottish nobility resented English interference, and tensions between the two kingdoms increased. The death of Margaret also had consequences for Norway. King Erik II, who had hoped to strengthen his kingdom's ties with Scotland through his daughter's succession, was left without a direct heir. The Norwegian court recognized the significance of Margaret's death, both for the royal family and for the kingdom's relationship with Scotland. The hopes for a peaceful union between the two kingdoms were dashed, and the political landscape of Northern Europe was altered. The broader European context was also affected by Margaret's death. The balance of power between Scotland, England, and Norway was disrupted, and neighboring kingdoms watched developments with interest. The possibility of a union between Scotland and England through Margaret's marriage to the English prince was lost, and the future of the Scottish crown became uncertain. The succession crisis in Scotland led to a period of instability and conflict. The Great Cause was marked by legal disputes, political maneuvering, and the involvement of foreign powers. The Scottish nobility was divided into factions, each supporting a different claimant to the throne. The authority of the Guardians of Scotland was undermined, and the risk of civil war increased. Edward I's intervention in the Scottish succession was a turning point in the history of the British Isles. His efforts to assert control over Scotland led to a series of conflicts known as the Wars of Scottish Independence. The Scottish people, faced with the threat of English domination, rallied around leaders such as William Wallace and Robert the Bruce. The death of Margaret, Maid of Norway, was a catalyst for these events. Her brief life and untimely death had a profound impact on the political landscape of medieval Europe. The hopes for a peaceful union between Scotland and Norway were dashed, and the future of the Scottish crown became the subject of intense dispute. The consequences of Margaret's death were felt for generations. The Wars of Scottish Independence shaped the history of Scotland and its relationship with England. The legacy of the Maid of Norway remains significant, as her story illustrates the complexities of medieval politics and the challenges faced by child monarchs. The period following Margaret's death was marked by significant challenges and conflicts for Scotland. The absence of a clear heir to the throne created a power vacuum, and the ambitions of powerful noble families threatened to undermine the stability of the kingdom. The Guardians of Scotland, who had governed in Margaret's name, were left without a monarch to support, and their authority was challenged by competing factions. The most significant challenge was the succession crisis known as the Great Cause. Multiple claimants to the Scottish throne emerged, each with a legitimate claim based on their descent from earlier Scottish kings. The two most prominent claimants were John Balliol and Robert Bruce. The dispute between these claimants led to a period of legal and political maneuvering, as each sought to secure the support of the Scottish nobility and the approval of King Edward I of England. Edward I's involvement in the succession dispute was a source of conflict. He offered to act as an arbitrator, but his true aim was to assert control over Scotland. He summoned the Scottish claimants to Norham in 1291 and demanded that they recognize him as overlord of Scotland. The Scottish nobility, facing the threat of civil war, reluctantly agreed to Edward's terms. The selection of John Balliol as King of Scots in 1292 did not resolve the underlying tensions. Balliol's authority was limited by Edward's influence, and the Scottish nobility resented English interference. The relationship between Balliol and Edward quickly deteriorated, as Balliol sought to assert his independence and the Scottish nobility resisted English control. The conflict between Scotland and England escalated into open warfare in 1296. Edward I invaded Scotland, deposed Balliol, and declared himself ruler of the kingdom. The Scottish people, faced with the threat of English domination, rallied around leaders such as William Wallace and Robert the Bruce. The Wars of Scottish Independence began, marking a period of prolonged conflict between the two kingdoms. The challenges faced by Scotland during this period were not limited to the succession crisis and the threat of English domination. The kingdom also faced internal divisions as powerful noble families competed for influence and control. The authority of the Guardians of Scotland was undermined by these rivalries, and the risk of civil war increased. The broader European context also contributed to the challenges faced by Scotland. The balance of power between kingdoms was maintained through dynastic marriages, treaties, and military campaigns. The fate of the Scottish crown had implications for the wider region, as neighboring kingdoms watched developments with interest. The death of Margaret, Maid of Norway, was a catalyst for these events. Her brief life and untimely death had a profound impact on the political landscape of medieval Europe. The hopes for a peaceful union between Scotland and Norway were dashed, and the future of the Scottish crown became the subject of intense dispute. The challenges and conflicts that followed Margaret's death shaped the history of Scotland and its relationship with England. The legacy of the Maid of Norway remains significant, as her story illustrates the complexities of medieval politics and the challenges faced by child monarchs. The aftermath of Margaret's death brought about major changes in the political structure and future of Scotland. The most immediate outcome was the end of the direct royal line of the House of Dunkeld, which had ruled Scotland for over 2 centuries. With no clear successor, the Scottish throne became the subject of competing claims, leading to a period of instability and foreign intervention. The process known as the Great Cause involved 13 claimants to the Scottish throne, but the 2 principal rivals were John Balliol and Robert Bruce. The Scottish nobility, unable to reach a consensus, appealed to King Edward I of England to arbitrate the dispute. Edward's involvement marked a significant shift in the balance of power in the British Isles. By accepting Edward as the arbitrator, the Scottish nobles inadvertently acknowledged his authority over Scotland. Edward I's decision in favor of John Balliol in 1292 did not resolve the underlying tensions. Balliol's reign was marked by constant interference from Edward, who treated Scotland as a vassal state. Balliol was required to pay homage to Edward and to follow English policy in both domestic and foreign affairs. This arrangement was deeply unpopular among the Scottish nobility and the general population. The imposition of English authority led to widespread resentment and resistance. In 1295, Balliol attempted to assert his independence by forming an alliance with France, known as the Auld Alliance. This move was seen as a direct challenge to Edward's authority. In response, Edward invaded Scotland in 1296, deposed Balliol, and installed English officials to govern the kingdom. The English occupation of Scotland was met with fierce resistance. Local leaders, most notably William Wallace, organized uprisings against English rule. Wallace's victory at the Battle of Stirling Bridge in 1297 demonstrated the determination of the Scots to defend their independence. However, the conflict continued for many years, with periods of both Scottish and English control. The long-term outcome of Margaret's death and the subsequent succession crisis was the beginning of the Wars of Scottish Independence. These wars, which lasted from 1296 to 1357, fundamentally altered the relationship between Scotland and England. The struggle for independence became a defining feature of Scottish national identity. The political changes also affected the structure of Scottish government. The role of the Guardians of Scotland, established during Margaret's minority, set a precedent for collective leadership in times of crisis. The experience of foreign intervention and occupation reinforced the importance of national unity and resistance to external control. In Norway, the death of Margaret ended hopes for a dynastic union with Scotland. King Eric II continued to rule Norway, but his influence in Scottish affairs diminished. The Norwegian royal family maintained its status, but the loss of the Maid of Norway marked the end of a significant chapter in the kingdom's history. The broader European context was also affected by these events. The failure to secure a peaceful union between Scotland and England through Margaret's marriage to the English prince had long-term consequences for the balance of power in the region. The ongoing conflict between the two kingdoms influenced the policies of neighboring states and contributed to the complex web of alliances and rivalries that characterized medieval Europe. The major changes and outcomes following Margaret's death were not limited to political and military developments. The succession crisis and the wars that followed had significant social and economic impacts. The disruption of trade, the destruction of property, and the displacement of populations were common features of the period. The experience of war and occupation left a lasting mark on Scottish society. The legacy of Margaret, Maid of Norway, is reflected in the subsequent history of Scotland. Her brief life and untimely death set in motion a series of events that shaped the destiny of the kingdom. The struggle for independence, the assertion of national identity, and the resistance to foreign domination became central themes in Scottish history. Margaret, Maid of Norway, did not live beyond the age of 7, and her death marked the end of her direct involvement in historical events. However, the consequences of her passing continued to influence the course of Scottish and Norwegian history for many years. After Margaret's death in Orkney in 1290, her body was returned to Norway, where she was buried in Christ Church, Bergen. The Norwegian court mourned the loss of the young queen, and her father, King Eric II, continued to rule Norway until his own death in 1299. The hopes for a dynastic union between Norway and Scotland were abandoned, and the two kingdoms pursued separate paths. In Scotland, the period following Margaret's death was marked by instability and conflict. The selection of John Balliol as king did not bring lasting peace. Balliol's reign was short and troubled, ending with his deposition by Edward I in 1296. The subsequent English occupation of Scotland led to widespread resistance and the emergence of new leaders, most notably William Wallace and Robert the Bruce. The Wars of Scottish Independence, which began in the aftermath of Margaret's death, continued for several decades. The conflict saw periods of both Scottish and English control, with significant battles such as Stirling Bridge, Falkirk, and Bannockburn. The struggle for independence became a central theme in Scottish history, shaping the identity and aspirations of the nation. The final resolution of the succession crisis came with the recognition of Robert the Bruce as King of Scots in 1306. Bruce's victory at the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314 secured Scottish independence, at least temporarily. The Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton in 1328 formally recognized Scotland as an independent kingdom, ending the first phase of the Wars of Scottish Independence. The legacy of Margaret, Maid of Norway, was remembered in both Scotland and Norway. In Scotland, her brief reign as queen was seen as a symbol of lost opportunity and the dangers of disputed succession. In Norway, she was remembered as the last direct link to the Scottish royal family. The final events of Margaret's story are marked by her untimely death and the far-reaching consequences for the kingdoms she was meant to unite. Her life serves as a reminder of the complexities of medieval politics and the challenges faced by child monarchs. Margaret, Maid of Norway, occupies a unique place in the history of Scotland and Norway. Born into royalty, she became Queen of Scots at the age of 3, but never set foot in the kingdom she was meant to rule. Her brief life was shaped by the ambitions of powerful men, the complexities of dynastic politics, and the uncertainties of a world in transition. The death of Margaret in 1290 marked the end of the direct royal line of the House of Dunkeld and triggered a succession crisis that led to decades of conflict. The Great Cause, the Wars of Scottish Independence, and the eventual recognition of Scottish sovereignty were all consequences of the power vacuum created by her passing. Margaret's story illustrates the challenges faced by child monarchs in medieval Europe. Her claim to the throne was recognized by the leading powers of the day, but her youth and absence from Scotland left her dependent on the actions of others. The political significance of her position was recognized by all parties, and her safe arrival in Scotland was seen as essential to the stability of the kingdom. The legacy of Margaret, Maid of Norway, is reflected in the subsequent history of Scotland. The struggle for independence, the assertion of national identity, and the resistance to foreign domination became central themes in Scottish history. Her brief life and untimely death set in motion a series of events that shaped the destiny of the kingdom. Margaret's story is a reminder of the complexities of medieval politics and the challenges faced by those born into positions of power. Her life and death had a profound impact on the history of Scotland and Norway, and her legacy endures as a symbol of the hopes and uncertainties of a world in transition.